Hello, thanks for joining us today. I'm Sarah Traver. I'm the director here at Traver Gallery, and I am thrilled to be here to do an exhibition walkthrough with April Surgent. April, thanks for this beautiful exhibition titled Future Unfolding. You've been showing with the gallery for about 10 years now. Yeah. This is your fourth solo exhibition here. Can you tell us a little bit about the title, just to start with, and kind of how you think about the work?
Yeah, I guess for the last 15 years I've been focusing on climate change or research on climate change and really kind of considering how things are changing. And this show doesn't necessarily specifically represent one research adventure that I've been on, but kind of accumulation of all of these different things that I've been researching and really thinking about weather and habitability and materiality. There's a few different pieces here that have different surface embellishments on them that, well, I guess we'll talk about it in a minute, but if, they're talking about this antithetical dialogue between permanence and impermanence, and that's kind of where I see this body of work going and where I feel how our future is going. Researching so heavily climate change related things over the last decade or more, I guess, has really led me to thinking about where we're going and how we've changed and what kind of the next steps are. We already have all this information and really thinking about where we're going next.
One thing that is interesting to me about this exhibition is that this particular body of work came out of a period of time when you were actually here in the Pacific Northwest. And your previous exhibitions have always kind of revolved specifically around a particular research project or experience that you've had out in the field, and doing photographs from that particular place and then going back to the studio and kind of digesting that information and translating it into these incredible cameo-engraved glassworks. Process is the same here. And I wonder just how did you experience the difference of like being out in the field and having that specific research focus versus really taking what you've learned from that research that you've done previously and being here at home in the Pacific Northwest?
Well, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, so this is really a place that I know very intimately and I've kind of watched my entire life. And a lot of the research trips that I've been to have been really focused on these places that are really rapidly changing and where it's really obvious to see these changes. And what I've noticed now is that you don't really have to travel very far to see the impacts of climate change and how things are happening. So for me, I guess it started with COVID, being stuck really in one place. And then after that, my husband and I have had a really intense building project at our land for the last few years. So really I've gotten to see just my surrounding environments in this really intense way and looking at just where I'm at. So it's been a really neat kind of reflection on my home and instead of looking at these indicator ecosystems like Antarctica or Alaska or the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, seeing just right outside my front door and taking a look just kind of right here. It's been a really kind of satisfying experience to get to know and look at my surrounding environments that I know so well, like in a different light than I would normally look at them.
Yeah, well, where you guys are out in Port Townsend area, you're out on a bluff, and maybe we can look at this piece to start with.
Yeah.
We're talking about your specific environment, and this piece relates directly to that.
Yeah, this piece is very close to my front door. It's actually looking off of about a 200-foot bluff cliff, and it's what it looks like both in extreme fog, which we get a lot of because we're right off of the Straits of Juan de Fuca, but it's also what it looks like when we have extreme smoke events from forest fires. And as I'm thinking about weather and habitability, and I have really been also considering how, these things change the way that we view the world and interact with our environments. And so some of these pieces in the show are kind of about learning how to differentiate between the two, between smoke and fog. And it seems like really obvious when you say it, but when you live in a marine environment, sometimes the differences between the two are a lot closer than you might kind of imagine them to be. And so this was really looking out off of the bluff and being able to see the water ripples there, but really you should be able to see the horizon line there. So looking through the trees with kind of a backlit light, and the back of this piece is cut through, so there's kind of a glowing yellow tint there, but it could really be smoke or fog, and kind of depending on maybe your mood for the day when you're contemplating the work. This piece is called Will Our Children Know the Exquisite Line Between the Sea and the Sky?
You touched on briefly carving through the back of the piece. Can you talk a little bit about your process? I know people are sort of familiar with the term cameo, and kind of calls to mind the cameo necklaces that might have been part of your great-grandmother's collection. And you're using a technique that's related to that, but obviously to a totally different end. And
yeah, I've been doing cameo engraving for a while, but not quite on this scale. Whether it's a large piece or a small piece, it's a very similar process where I'm overlaying a sheet of white glass. I'm using a glass called bullseye glass. It's a solid color glass. So it's a sheet of white, and then in this specific piece, I don't know if you can kind of see it here, you can see a yellow and then like a teal color there. So I layer the glass together like a sandwich, almost like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It starts off, I cut the glass to size, and then I fuse it together in the kiln, and then I carve through the top layer of white to reveal the underlying colors. And I use both diamond and, I mostly use just diamond wheels. And for these large panels, I'm using hand tools off of like a Fordham or a wheel grinder. And for the smaller panels, I use an engraving lathe.
you mentioned that some of these pieces relate to thinking about the difference between smoke and fog.
Yes.
There's one piece in this exhibition that very specifically addresses that, and also I think is a wonderful example of how you think about your use of materials in how you bring these ideas to life. Can you talk about this piece a little bit?
Yeah, this is called Glimpse of Light Through Water and Ash. I live in a really wooded environment, so this is another kind of play on looking through the well, it's very similar to the piece we were just looking at, where I'm thinking about how light is transmitted through smoke and through fog. Here for these two pieces, I've used 2 layers of white, so there's actually quite a high relief on both of these pieces. But I think when you first look at them, they look really similar, how the light might be transmitted, but it's like a slight shift in the color.
Yeah, and I think just looking over the camera here as we're filming, it's pretty subtle in the camera, and it's pretty subtle in real life too, but there's a distinct difference between the color palettes here. Even though the imagery is so similar, you're looking at one that's got this sort of clean bluish tint to
Yeah,
it.
yep.
And the one on the right then, of course, has this sort of greeny yellow tint, which for any of us who have lived through recent forest fire smoke events is
Yes.
a very familiar thing. Another aspect that I love about this particular diptych is just how abstract you've gotten with it.
Yeah.
It's such a familiar feeling to me of being in a forest environment and looking kind of up through sunlit branches and that sort of diffuse light and almost kind of out of focus quality that occurs when you look from kind of a dark environment up into the light.
Yeah.
And they're just exquisite, April. I also love the relief that you achieved with these pieces.
I start off, for inspiration for the engravings, I start off using photographs, and I took the photographs for these pieces as we were kind of driving through a forested environment. So that's kind of where this image came from. The piece over here, it's called Bend with the Wind. With climate change, we've had a big thing is increased windstorms, and just kind of watching how the trees move in and out of the wind has been kind of an incredible experience, actually, living under the trees, but also thinking about adaptation, and that's where the title comes from, is bending with the wind and making adjustments. Sometimes I feel like we're learning a lot of things about climate change and the things that we need to do, but we're not really willing to adapt or move to make the changes that we need to. It's a bit of a jump there, but kind of that's where that connection comes from, the title.
Can you talk a little bit about how you approach content and meaning in your work? I mean, because the subject matter that you're dealing with is pretty heavy subject matter. And it's not something that necessarily makes everybody comfortable.
Yeah.
And it's not something that I think most people associate with beauty, right? And yet you are creating these pieces which are like undeniably gorgeous artworks. How do you think about content in relation to that?
I think for me, because climate change is so scary, it's really important to me to not focus on that like fear factor. I think that fear is very destabilizing and immobilizing and not very inspiring. And so I try to focus on like these really beautiful things that you can see even in like the scary times. I think it's important to focus on beautiful things, even if it is in the middle of a disaster, and thinking about maybe the change or the personal experiences we've had in a windstorm in the trees, or just thinking about what a tree looks like in the wind for this specific piece. But yeah, just I don't like to focus on the fear factor, because I love life, I love living in the planet, and I also want to celebrate the beautiful moments that we have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about this group of four over here? These are a little bit distinct from some of the other pieces in the show, in that they actually bring in a built environment.
Yeah. This is actually just my drive to and from town from my home, but again, this piece is called Learning to Differentiate Between Smoke and Fog. And the other thing that's kind of unique about these pieces is I've applied a watercolor wash to the surface of them. And this is where I'm really playing with that antithetical dialogue between permanence and impermanence. I've always viewed myself as a record keeper, and thinking about in this time where everything is stored digitally and the proverbial cloud. And here I am making these really archival records that could potentially last into perpetuity. I mean, glass is such an archival thing. So I liked the play on adding a very temporary medium to the surface of the glass. Not that it would, I mean, the watercolor will last on the surface of it, but over, hundreds of years it probably
right. I mean, as far as materials go, glass is sort of the ultimate archival material.
Exactly.
Honestly, I think people think about it as being such a fragile material, but it actually holds up incredibly well over time. And I love that idea of playing with that permanence and impermanence. There's a large piece that's actually on the main sort of focal wall in the exhibition that really uses that pigmentation in such an interesting way.
And for me too, just like that play with the material has been a really fun way to get a different level of expression in the engravings. Sometime when you're engraving, you have to, it's such a slow, laborious process to be able to get a very light, expressive touch can be a little bit difficult. And so being able to apply that motion onto, I guess, the glass has been a really fun exploration for me. And color, being able to add color as well has been a real joy. I guess people always say, "Oh, your work is black and white," but I do actually really like color. I just don't generally use it very much. So it's been a really fun exploration.
Do you work with watercolor?
I do
regularly.
Yeah. I mean, I have no training or anything in watercolor, but I really enjoy doing watercolor and drawing and things that are a lot looser and faster than engraving, because engraving can become this like very laborious, time-consuming process. So I really enjoy being able to just make a really expressive mark that isn't necessarily this really laborious kind of long to make mark. For me, the application of the paints also, it touches on this precarious moment that we're in, of definitely talking about like that change and where we're headed. Who knows?
Let's take a look at the river piece, if we can.
And this piece I used acrylic on the surface of this piece, and I used it a little bit differently than I did in the other pieces, where I really wanted to highlight the texture of the engraving. Sometimes, even though the engraving has a lot of texture on it, you can't necessarily see the texture of it as much. And this kind of harkens back to old like woodblock prints where they would be, or lino cuts, or any sort of engraving, non-glass engraving, where you might put an ink onto an engraved plate and be able to dry brush the surface and really get that texture to show through. It's also another way to add a little bit of color. This piece was inspired by a research trip that I went up to Alaska, and there was again a really heavy smoke event, and it really was not smoky where we were, but off in the distance, kind of in this. It was a very weird perspective that we were in, where we were kind of clear, but very close to us it was very smoky, and there was this kind of light and color coming through. And again, it was just this like, it was actually it was one of the most stunning things I've ever seen. But it's, it's smoke, so it's a little scary, but it's that kind of, I don't know, dialogue of where we're at right now, and really focusing on like what things are like right now.
Wonderful. I love that you touched on the sort of wood block print.
Yeah.
In this case, one of the things I find so interesting about this particular piece is is the composition and the way that you use black and white in this very kind of formal way, and in sort of an inverse way than I think what most people would expect, that the sky is white, the water is white, and the landscape almost recedes.
Yeah.
It creates this incredible dynamic composition that almost, like, if you kind of squint your eyes a little bit or let your eyes go out of focus, is actually just a beautiful abstraction.
Cool. Yeah, when I had this piece in my studio for a time before I brought it into the gallery, and it really had a lot of play with the natural light and shadows hitting it, and it really felt like the piece there was a lot of motion in it, which I was drawn to with this piece.
I mean, you capture these incredible details, the trees along the horizon almost kind of receding, and like the cloud formations. It's just an exquisite piece. And then the reflected trees so subtly engraved into the water here is so beautiful. Let's take a look at the piece on the other side of this wall. For me personally, this is a very nostalgic piece. It's something that is a view that, as somebody from the Pacific Northwest, I feel so familiar with this exact scene. And that sort of nostalgia that you're able to capture or like cause that reaction in your work is something that I think is really particularly effective. This, the way that the fog or smoke is sort of hanging on the trees here, and you can almost just see these subtle trees in the background on the hill.
This piece was very specifically fog. The title of it is Lungfuls of Sea Fog and Trees, and I have spent a lot of time on the water and around the trees in the Pacific Northwest, and I was really, when I was coming up with this piece, I was feeling very nostalgic for that, like, very unique Pacific Northwest experience of like breathing in this deep marine sea air and the smell and almost taste of the trees sometimes. So I was feeling very nostalgic for that kind of memory of that experience. That's I guess in a lot of marine environments you have that, but not necessarily with the trees
this to me is Vancouver,
Yeah.
the north end of Vancouver Island.
It was
right? Like,
yeah,
I just am like immediately in that place, and that's something that, whether it's that place or another place for somebody else, it's just that you are able to capture with your work, that you place us in an environment, and there's a kind of quiet poetry to it. It like taps into that thing that happens when you're in these natural spaces. It's like, maybe it's touching on the sublime, or maybe it's something a little bit more subtle than that, but it is that experience that I think is so special we have as humans when we go to these wild places, or even just a bluff above Port Townsend that doesn't seem wild, but it is very uniquely its own. And I love that you're able to capture that.
I get sometimes a little hesitant to talk too much about where things come from specifically, because I do like people to make their own connections to an image, and I don't want to influence that too much. I like to think of my work as like a memory or a connection to a memory and an experience. I think that in this time where more people live in urban environments as opposed to natural environments, where we've become so incredibly disconnected from the natural environment, that when I make a piece like this, I want a person to wrap their own experiences around it, as opposed to my own experiences. I would love for people to know what it's about too, but I also like to build that connection, and to think about that relationship or experience that people might have had.
Well, I think you've done that incredibly successfully with this show. It's probably a good place to stop.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, April. It's really been a pleasure to talk with you about the work, and Congratulations on the beautiful exhibition. This show will be up through the month of April, and I hope you guys will all come in and see it in person. It's really an extraordinary exhibition.
And thank you for having me. It's been like an epic 10 years of working together.
I love it.
Yeah, it's really
Thanks,
great.
April.
Thank you.
Okay, bye, thanks.